let me just introduce how I mean, everyone's bios everyone's bio is on the platform, so we're not going to read them, but I would like to share how I know all of these wonderful people. And ladies first, I'll start with Clara. When I left JP Morgan in 2001, I was really lost and confused about what I wanted to do next. And I had this idea that there was the World Bank, and there was the African Development Bank and the Asian Development Bank, but there was no American Development Bank. And so I had this whole vision of a business to create an American Development Bank. And I went in and spoke to the woman who ran philanthropy at Morgan for some advice and tips. And she said, there's someone you need to go talk to. She's the best in the business, and her name is Clara Miller. And Clara was running an organization that she founded called the Nonprofit Finance Fund, and was deep into thinking about aligning capital flows with social purpose. And so that's how we met. I don't know when that was. It would have been probably 2002 or 3 or maybe 4. But Clara's been in this game, I think literally her entire career, and but primarily as a practitioner, both at Nonprofit Finance Fund and then at the Heron Foundation, which was probably the leading foundation to embrace aligning its portfolio, not just its grant making, with the purpose of the foundation. So I'm delighted that she's here to share her experience and wisdom. Bill and Raj, I was just discussing, I think I met both of them at the same conference in Boston, would have been around 2007 or so. It was a Corporation 2020 event that Alan White hosted, and Alan also was one of the sort of the founding fathers of this whole idea of purpose-driven corporations and aligning with environmental and social purpose. Raj based in London, and Bill based in Massachusetts, and so we have Raj will bring an international perspective, or at least a European perspective, to this as well. And to jump into it, why don't we just, if I can just ask each of you, and we'll turn this into a dialogue, but each of you just share briefly from your own historical perspective, how we got to this moment where ESG is in the news, in the debate, in the ideological debate between the kind of extreme right and the extreme left, let's call it. But maybe just give us your perspective on the journey to this moment as you've experienced it. And Clara, why don't we start with you, since I think you've probably been in the journey the longest.
Okay, sorry about that. I will try to be brief because it has been a long journey, and I'll just say, when I got involved, I'm going to talk about ESG, which has been a relatively recent piece of the puzzle. When I joined the Heron Foundation, as John said, it was well down the road to the idea that, well, wait a minute, why don't we have 100% of our assets dedicated to our mission? We're a philanthropic institution. Why aren't we just saying 100% of our assets behind helping people and communities help themselves out of poverty? And I think we were at 40% then. And it became very clear very quickly that, and we wanted exposures up and down the capital market. It wasn't going to be that we're going to just finance nonprofit organizations, which I'd had a lot of experience doing. We wanted to be a shareholder. We wanted to do private equity. We wanted to do bond, everything. Because it's not going to help people in poverty if you only fix a kind of something in a terrarium over by a foundation to do really great work. It won't really help everybody. And we had experienced that during the financial crisis, where our portfolio of CDFI debt performed better than anything in our portfolio at all, period, over that time. And so, but at the same time, what was happening outside our walls was the greatest stripping of assets from poor and middle class people in the history of the United States. So if we're not paying attention to that, we're not doing our jobs. So, okay. So we had a product that had to have it was an exchange traded fund, community development investing index or something like that. And we were refreshing the IP. And so we got to go in and see what the MSCI data was that was feeding into the ratings on that in that product.
The Morgan Stanley index for people that are not familiar.
Yeah, sorry. And MSCI is a big data provider. They're very opaque, so you really can't see what's going into these ratings. And it was appalling. I mean, it was things like, okay, so this is this employer just got a high rating because they comply with equal opportunity employment law. They have a policy check, so it was check boxes and stuff like that. So anyway, so just at that moment, I met a woman named Jean Rogers, who was the founder of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And we thought, aha, if you understand a little about SEC law, the Securities and Exchange Commission, you know that companies are required to disclose financially material, they call them, things that investors would want to know before they make a decision. And it's part of the transparency of American markets. It's part of the hallmark. It's fair play. It's lots of other things. And there were no disclosure standards for ESG, including the S, which we just happened to be interested in, but we were interested in all of it because we thought it was all relevant to the people we were trying to help. And that led us to become a financer of providing what we called enterprise capital to SASB. I became a board member and became very involved in the making of that particular brand of sausage. And a conversation around all the other brands of sausage that were sort of similar to SASB at the time. And so I think that's the context that I represent. I think I'll stop there because we have lots of covered.
Yeah, beautiful. Raj, why don't you share particularly not only your personal journey into this, but also just share with us what's different about this conversation in Europe than it is in the United States, at least as you understand it.
Thanks for inviting me, John, and it's great to meet Clara in person for the first time. We've been chatting on emails for years.
Right.
Very cool. So I joined the community in late 1990s, early 2000s. I was brought in as the head of responsible investment, as it was called then, at a very large UK pension fund. It's the equivalent fund to TIA-CREF in the States. It's called University Superannuation Scheme. Scheme not being a bad thing in the UK, and
a little translation there.
And I was appointed because the fund had been targeted by some very committed and vocal activists who persuaded the trustees to do responsible investment. It was a completely blank sheet of paper. No one really knew what it meant. There had been some work around SRI funds, socially responsible investment funds, as there were in the States, but that was quite niche. And so we, at that phase, particularly in the UK and Northern Europe, developed a definition of responsible investment which was in tune with the needs of long horizon asset owners. And so that became a key driver of the field in Europe at that time. So the long horizon, the asset owner, the fiduciary duty piece was very important. And also it developed out of the corporate governance stewardship piece. So the idea that as investors, you had rights and responsibilities which were absolutely core to your role. And I think those two things are slightly different from what I experienced in North America.
Particularly the responsibility part.
I don't want to comment about that. but I do remember arriving at another conference where the senior corporate governance official at a big state pension fund poked me in the chest and accused me of being a SRI person, and I don't believe it was a compliment. So we focused on things like the AIDS crisis, the fact that our company, our investments were in pharmaceutical companies that were holding up access to affordable drugs. I was fortunate to be able to set up with colleagues a project called the Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change, which is focused on the risks that climate change posed and the responsibilities that investors had to deal with climate change as a stewardship issue. Out of that grew, we and others were involved in the startup of PRI and the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment. And as you probably will remember, at the start, integration and stewardship were equally important pillars of the project. One of the things which I think we need to acknowledge is that over time, for a range of reasons which we can go into, the integration pillar completely dwarfed the stewardship pillar. And not only that, but the integration pillar got reframed as a kind of dumbed down stock picking approach, as opposed to dealing with the failure to integrate analysis into sell-side analysts, credit rating agencies. So it became an issue for the individual fund manager to stock pick individual funds, which is of course completely inconsistent with systemic risk. You cannot stock pick your way out of a climate crisis.
Yeah, which we'll dig into this in a moment. But one of the, I think, the important things that the current media completely misses is that there's this, to use Bill's beautiful phrase, an outside in versus an inside out way to think about this issue. Yeah. Outside in being the risks to an organization, to a company, posed by external factors like climate change. Whereas inside out is, and Bill will expand on this, the impact that the company has on the systemic risks that we're all facing. And those two issues are often not even conflated. They're just not acknowledged in the conversation, and it leads to a tremendous bit of confusion. So if everyone can take one thing away from this conversation, it's to force us to decide whether we're talking about this inside out or the outside in issue before we even continue the conversation. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and Bill, that's maybe a good segue into your work. And don't tell us about, I mean, we're gonna spend a lot of time talking about the difference between sustainability and ESG in a second, but help us understand your journey into the work just for now.
Sure, great. And that particular segue, I'm glad to see that Lois Guthrie is on the line. She, going back maybe four years ago, we really were engaged in this sort of outside in versus inside out clarification. So there's others on the line here who've done important work. So
I see Ralph Thurm is here. He must have something to do with that. Hi, Ralph.
Yep. Ralph actually probably goes back further than that. GRI, Ralph recently discovered. Ralph is my colleague in R3.0. And Ralph was sort of COO of Global Reporting Initiative early on. And GRI has always taken an outside in and in particular inside out approach, or at least it did in the early days. I came into the field completely by accident from a journalistic route. I was I just got a gig writing about socially responsible investing at the turn of the millennium or so. And so I came into the field before the term ESG existed. And so I was there sort of covering this development when ESG came onto the scene in 2004 with a United Nations report called Who Cares Wins. and also some related work from UNEP FI on sell-side analysts that Raj was actually fundamentally important in helping to create that. I think that the important thing to recognize, and I was joking earlier before everybody got on, that it took me like a decade to fully come to crystallize this understanding. ESG, when it was first asserted, was really kind of, if you look back on it, a no-brainer. It's like it said, well, you have a fiduciary duty to address the material issues that might impact your investment or your organization. And the fact that that includes environmental and social and governance issues is sort of like, well, yeah, duh. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous that we had to create a field that reminded people of the fact that fiduciary duty is all inclusive. It doesn't leave environmental, social, and governance issues sort of off to the side. They're part of reality. And I think I consider that kind of outside in risk. What are the outside in risks that involve environmental, social, and governance factors for an organization, a core part of fiduciary duty? I find this a fairly uncontroversial proposition. And that's sort of one form of ESG. I think that as time
Bill,
went on,
can I challenge you on that? It's uncontroversial only because the hardcore fiduciary duty people would acknowledge that financial risks stem from ESG factors. Isn't that a fair statement?
Yeah. I'm being a little bit provocative here. I know that some people do find this controversial. I don't, whether they're doing that sort of in earnest or with any kind of intellectual grounding to what they're saying, or whether it's purely political is another question altogether. But yeah, I think that it's a fairly straightforward assertion. I think where we get into trouble is when ESG sort of migrated its purview, so to speak. So I think that the fact that there were environmental, social, and governance issues at play, that a second expression of ESG emerged, and that was addressing the inside out, or the accountability of an organization for its impacts on the world. So inside meaning the organization itself, the company itself; outside meaning the real world. And I think that's where this articulation really got stuck at what we call an incrementalist level, where it was saying, well, if you're incrementally slightly less bad this year than you were last year, then you're fulfilling your ESG sort of duties, if you will. But so in other words, ESG doesn't really have any kind of mechanism for saying, well, what are the impacts that actually matter for this organization? Like, what do they have a material kind of accountability for? And then more importantly, like, how much is enough? Like, what impact is sufficiently good, or what's impact is bad, and that you have to do a sufficient amount of healing that or addressing it. So this is where, in my experience, right about the time that ESG emerged is when I came onto the notion of sustainability context from the Global Reporting Initiative, which took a decidedly different approach. It was not incrementalist in the slightest, or it was incrementalist in the sense that it said, well, you can make incremental improvement, but you have to have an end goal in sight. And that end goal is respecting the thresholds, or the limits and demands, as GRI put it in at that time, that exist in the real world. So like, a 1.5 degree climate threshold, that would be an example of something that is what we might call normative, or that it's a goal that you must comply with. Otherwise, we are going to experience climate hell. Other such thresholds exist, but that's sort of moving into the ESG versus sustainability. So I guess I'll leave it at that for now.
Hold that, because we'll dive into that in more detail in a second. But I do think maybe Clara, this is, I'd be curious if you agree with this. You, in a sense, were part of the early SRI iteration of what we now call ESG, which was very much trying to hold companies accountable for their impact on society, as opposed to thinking about factors that would affect the stock price of a company. And a lot of the early SRI funds used their fund management fees to play a very activist role in influencing companies' behavior around issues like how they treat their employees and whatnot. So am I right to say that this inside out orientation of ESG is actually where the SRI movement began, or would you disagree with that?
I think it was more, I don't think people really thought about it in those terms then. I think that when things happened, it was using a new tool or expanding the toolkit.
Yeah.
And when Heron was doing what it did, and when I got involved with SASB, I think the context that we were looking at was the whole market. We didn't necessarily, there was we want to do good ourselves, and we need information by which we as an investor can make informed decisions, whatever our idiotic framework might be.
Mm-hmm.
It might be that we want more oil companies in the world, or we think every kid 15 and under should have a gun. I mean, I don't know. Those are some people's values, but we wanted to be able to make those decisions ourselves because, we're Americans and we get all that information. But the thing that was missing, and if you think about the way securities law works in the United States, sometimes it's about disclosure and transparency. And it was pretty clear that the basis on which companies were disclosing material information was not standard. It was not based on the same kind of rules and regulations that, for example, financial disclosure was based on, and that it was material. And one of the things about SASB, we can't forget, kind of the SEC framework that was in place. This is a law that actually exists. Companies have to disclose this information, and they have to do it based on this standard of materiality, which is imperfect, but it's a start. So the idea was, let's get a base and we'll start saying, let's try to change the DNA of the economy, rather than getting a bunch of well-meaning people to do something good and say, come on, we're doing something good, follow us. Mm-hmm. We're going to say, actually, let's just try to rewire the economy so these things start being something that are disclosable about every company. And if you don't have that, you don't have a basis for regulation. And my only, worry is that, yes, companies should be deciding whether they're doing enough or not, but they need a larger context and they need regulatory actors to actually make that happen. Yeah. And you have to have good accounting or you can't have good regulation.
Right. So the idea that the transparency is a necessary but insufficient piece of the challenge.
It's a base on which to build. And here in the United States, I mean, I would never have, there was a distant bell when I was on SASB's board where somebody sued the California State Teachers Pension Fund on the basis that because they were taking ESG measures into account, they weren't, this idea of the false dichotomy. If you do something about ESG, then you're going to, lose money. And the actual materiality standard of ESG disclosure metrics was the bulwark that was available, where we had two ex-chairs of the SEC on the board of SASB, and they basically said, this is settled law in the United States. Well, we'll see. But at the time, it seemed kind of reassuring that at least we wouldn't go back on this stuff because
Yeah.
there were a lot of opponents.
That was before the 2023 woke capitalism thing entered the.
Oh my God, you know, who knew? Who knew
So-
accounting standards could be so.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that in a second. I just want to also share my own kind of biases or perspective on this. I entered this conversation, this issue, through the lens of impact investing, which is a quite different lens. And I was part of and am part of a group who differentiates what I would call real investment flows, where you invest in a company to build a plant or to hire people, as opposed to investing in financial securities, where one person is buying and one person is selling. And I always had if I'm honest, somewhat of a disdain for the whole public securities ESG conversation, because at the end of the day, I felt, having observed capitalism up close and personal, I felt that certainly individual shareholders and even institutional shareholders have so little influence in companies that it was somewhat, hopeful thinking that it would have an impact. And I'd have to say I was wrong. I think one of the lessons of this rise of ESG is that it has actually shifted behavior in companies more than I ever would have predicted it would. But I also want to just, again, for the purpose of this conversation, I think it's important to distinguish between the influence a passive shareholder who votes their proxy and agitates and demands better disclosure and all that stuff can have, versus what a direct investor in an enterprise who most likely will have a board seat and influence the strategy of the business directly can have. And looking at this through a regenerative lens, which is one of the things we hope to distinguish in this dialogue, if one of the core tenets of a healthy living system is what we call right relationship, the relationship between shareholders in public companies and enterprise has been disintermediated by capital markets to such a degree that I would suggest there is somewhere between no relationship and an inadequate relationship. And when large institutional shareholders, and this gets to Raj's point about responsibility, when they abrogate their responsibility by simply investing in index funds by the billions and trillions, there's a systematic breakdown in how a healthy living, how a living system can work. And so, again, one of the takeaways I'd like to inject in the conversation, and you guys feel free to disagree with this, but that if we don't somehow catalyze a shift in the responsibility of the massive institutional investors away from passive index funds, which is the most popular form of investing in public companies now, and into active, engaged owners, the transformation required for individual companies, entire industries, and in fact, the entire economy is going to be extremely difficult. And we're left with only regulatory responses, which of course I think has to be part of it, but is has its own challenges. So I don't know, as a provocation, if any of you would like to disagree or expand on that thought.
I could jump in there and also connect with what Clara was saying. So again, I'm coming at it from a UK European perspective. To go back to my kind of point about that, at the start in the early 2000s, this development grew out of as much the corporate governance asset owner perspective as anything else. And there it was very clear that investors had the right and the responsibility to shape corporate strategy, appoint directors, fire directors, shape executive plans, etc. And so to ground this in an example, we were a fund that had about 1% of GSK, just under. We heard that GSK was taking Nelson Mandela to court for affordable access to HIV drugs, and we contacted the board to find out what was their thinking. At that time, they said that they weren't aware of it, and it was a decision that had been taken by the regional company. And shortly after our engagement, GSK pulled out of the court case, which then led to other companies pulling out of the court case, which then led to the court case collapsing. I don't for 1 minute say that we and a few other investors made that happen. I think we gave the company a legitimate reason for pulling out, as they were being pressured to do so by the WHO, the NGOs, even the World Bank, etc. They credited or blamed their investors. Now, things haven't gone well since then, because fast forward to the current pandemic, what we saw were large institutional investors, active investors of the kind that you were talking about, people who had 5%, 7%, 10% of Moderna and Pfizer, saying nothing, absolutely nothing about vaccine apartheid, profiting off those price gouging activities. So I think our challenge is that it's more complex than active equals good and passive equals bad. I think our problem is that shareholder value primacy has become a kind of fundamentalist ideology underpinning the whole of the investment system.
Yeah, I agree.
And that people haven't taken on board the fact that, come back to the climate crisis or the pandemic, if you have these things happening in your portfolio, which you inevitably do, then having a few companies or a sector as a whole that's profiting, be it fossil fuel companies or big pharma, doesn't make up for the huge negative impact on your portfolio. So coming back to this idea, or not coming back, but it led me to really get excited about the universal ownership idea, which was something that kind of, my good friend, oh my God, my brain's going, Bob, a traitor to his class, Nell Minnow's partner.
Bob
Monks.
Bob
Monks.
Yeah,
yeah.
popularized. And, you know, it's taken decades and decades and it's still not happening, but there are groups working on it now. And I think that's an area which we might want to talk about.
Interesting. I'm just I'm keeping an eye on the clock. So before we, rather than delve into universal ownership, I want to take us back to this question of the difference between sustainability and ESG. And for those who are not familiar with Bill's organization, Bill and Ralph's organization, who's on the call, R3.0, which used to be called Reporting 3.0, and they upgraded to R3.0 because it's more hip and cool, I suspect. But honestly, they've done, I think, the best work in the field of really digging into, and of course, they work with a lot of people outside the organizations. But you know, if you want to get to the essence and the real meat of the matter, I really highlight and encourage everyone to read their stuff. Some of their blogs are a little incendiary, maybe, but the work below the surface is really first class. And so, Bill, maybe can you give us, you know, this is an unfair question, but give us a brief tutorial on this concept of thresholds and context-based sustainability and how that's different than what you see in the ESG movement.
Great, and I will just first thank you for those kind words, and I would just what I always say is that it's not actually our writing that's incendiary. What's sort of on fire is what we're writing about. I think people often see that you know that our tone is problematic, but you know I'll actually sort of cite the the language of Alan White, who you mentioned earlier, who was sort of responsible for getting us together, a co-founder of the Global Reporting Initiative. And he said that, ESG does not by nature have a sustainability gene in it. And I think that that's true. So ESG is about incremental movement in a certain direction that has to do with environmental, social, or governance issues, but it has no sort of mechanism for addressing sort of how much, if you will. Riffing on Raj's point about—
But you would agree, Bill, with Clara's statement that having disclosure, transparency is a critical but insufficient piece of the puzzle, correct?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that yes, we were reporting 3.0 for a reason. We did believe that disclosure, that at the very least you have to disclose this. But I think that the distinction here is that a lot of people in the field have felt that ESG and sustainability are essentially synonymous. And so this notion of conflating ESG and sustainability is really, I think, problematic in the sense that sustainability actually says, and I'll again start from what Raj is saying, if you say that an organization has responsibility to those that it impacts, the question is sort of what resources is this company impacting? Who else relies on these resources? And how is the company going to manage its impacts so that it doesn't harm the well-being of those other people who rely on those resources, and also that there's a sufficient amount of those resources for those people to support their own well-being. So it's this sufficient amount of resources and the threshold of responsibility for respecting these resources that are the key to the context-based approach to sustainability. And so it's really the notion that there actually are thresholds, there are limits, there are dividing lines between an impact that a system or a group of people can handle, and an impact that they can't. This is sort of the tipping points notion in systems thinking.
So you would, just to make this concrete, you would suggest, your thinking suggests that pick any company, Waste Management,
Sure.
which is in the business now of not just collecting garbage, but recycling and all that. But they have a ecological footprint, they have a carbon emissions, and somehow the threshold question you're asking is, what's the right carbon emissions for that company for it to be considered a global citizen that's operating within the global planetary boundaries? Is that—
Yeah, I mean, that's the general sense, and there's kind of two ways to answer that. I mean, we just did some work with the UN for the last 4 years, the United Nations Research Institute on Social Development, and created a context-based or thresholds-based indicator for greenhouse gases that actually said 0 is the right amount,
right.
0 emissions. But we realized that to get from here to there, we basically have to follow the science. And so, just a quick anecdote, before 2012, the greenhouse gas protocol, or the mechanism for reporting greenhouse gas emissions, had no tie into the climate science. And so I pointed this out to the World Resources Institute, who's the secretariat for it. They agreed, and 3 years later, the Science Based Targets Initiative appeared, and that takes a thresholds-based approach, which says greenhouse gas emissions can't go down at some random ad hoc, rate. They have to go down at the rate that the scientific community says that it has to. So that's one example of a threshold.
But then how do you decide, how does one decide, how do we collectively decide how to allocate those thresholds across countries, industries, poor people, rich people, luxuries, necessities? It's incredibly complicated.
I mean, it is complicated, but we're doing it regardless. We're always allocating resources, and responsibility is always being allocated. We're just doing it blindly. We're pretending that we're not doing it. Right. And so we're doing it in grossly unjust ways. I'm not going to get into the technicalities of sort of what's emerged around that, John, because I don't think it's a good use of our
Yeah.
time. But I can point people to resources for that.
But there is implicit in your framework the need to allocate scarce resources. Essentially, we're dealing in a world where we need a new tool. It's called a quota, not a price. And
Well, I would say there's two things in that. Yes, we need to allocate scarce resources, but we also need to allocate responsibility for respecting thresholds. Those two
Right.
things go hand in hand.
Right.
And I think that, you can create, the myth is that money does this, that money allocates resources in a rational way. And the evidence just doesn't support that.
Right.
It doesn't allocate in a fair way, in a just way, in a proportionate way. And so we do have to sort of
and in a
intervene.
way that will guarantee that the game will continue. That we're
You
playing
got
an
it.
infinite game, not a finite game.
Exactly.
Again, this conversation could go on for hours. I'm again looking at the clock, and I do want to save time to bring our community into this conversation. So I'm going to shift gears one more time and maybe move back over to you, Clara. And this is an impossible question to answer, but given and by the way, I've intentionally not acknowledged the woke capitalism response. For those who are curious about my opinion, read about Leonard Leo and the $1.6 billion donation he received recently. And you'll see that it is part of the ideological divisive fight that just happens to be a current issue of choice, but is not really a part of an authentic intellectual debate about how to wrestle with the sustainability crisis that we're facing. So this is not, fair and balanced, give every voice an equal view. I don't think that voice deserves an airing, particularly in an hour here today. So that's the explanation for that. What I wanted to do before we open it up is just ask each of you very, very briefly, and this is impossible to answer, so that's why I'm not going to answer it, but what is a pathway to success in this dilemma look like? How do we know we're at least on the right track? Maybe is a better, easier question.
Well,
Want to take that first?
well, I'll stumble forward, as the saying goes, because I think that's the only way. I don't,
Stumble forward.
it's funny. I was thinking about this whole thing, and there's this sort of the idea of the Girl Scout approach to leadership, which, I was a crappy Girl Scout, but at any rate, I can tell you. But the idea was that you got everybody up the hill, as opposed to getting up to the top of the hill and yodeling that you'd gotten up at the top of the hill. And what's the matter with all you, down at the bottom? And I do think that Girl Scout approach to leadership is relevant in this situation. We have to accept that not everybody is going to get up the hill at the same time, but we have to try to herd everybody and to think in systems that enable that to happen, and also to use the systems we already have, however imperfect they may be. I think it's important to distinguish between having the metrics to keep score and keeping score and having referees on the field and deciding whether the game is even worth playing and other kinds of things.
Yeah.
And I think that we have a jurisdiction versus data issue. We need globally available data at the very least, just to know where we are from the Bill's point of view. Where are we relative to these science-based targets?
Yeah.
Is the UN going to be able to sort of keep trying to measure us?
Yeah.
Which is, how do jurisdictions actually regulate? Tell companies, actually, no, you can't pollute this stream. We do have regulation for some of this stuff. We don't have regulation for carbon emissions right now and a variety of other kinds of things. Yeah. So I think, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Clara, finish up.
No, anyway, so I just think that the path forward is a stumbling path forward, I'm sorry to say. And I think it's very important that we try to have, I think this conversation idea is key, that we can't be yodeling at each other. We have to be having conversations and accepting pluralism and the chafing, especially here in the United States. I mean, if anybody's met the US Congress, you know, the ESG, I mean, there's this North Dakota legislator quoted as saying, ESG is a satanic conspiracy to undermine God. And I thought, wow, you know,
That's pretty good.
This has dramatic possibilities. But anyway, so.
Nice. Well handled. Tough question. Raj, how about you? What does success look like?
So I would maybe throw out some points, just headline points. I think you're absolutely right, John. Bad faith actors need to be shut down assertively. I think the ESG community and Democrats have been way too weak on doing that. I think we need to think about and prioritize real world impact. So if we're serious about climate change, then let's start evaluating performance against greenhouse gas emissions in portfolios and actually do something about it. I love the Girl Guide thing. Without collaboration, this is not going to work. And without the collaboration of asset owners, this is going to be a very hypertrophied tail wagging the dog. The fund management system will make it perverse. So asset owners who are less conflicted, not non-conflicted, but less conflicted, need to take a big role. I think we need to just stop trying to pretend this isn't political. I mean, that's ridiculous. We can run and try and hide, but you know, this is values. And I think the ESG community has been quite naive, almost pretending that this is just a technocratic risk management process. I think related to that, I think it's really important that we reframe the debate. You know, I keep hearing decent, good-meaning people saying, but this doesn't harm returns. And, you know, if anyone's listened to George Lakoff for 1 second, well, they'll realize that all you do is reinforce the perspective that it harms returns. And so the technocrats and graph showers and data point fellow travelers amongst us need to learn how to engage in an advocacy approach. And maybe my last point, which goes back to the organization I started, Preventable Surprises. We need to use teachable moments. I haven't seen the US ESG industry deal with the big industrial accident in is it Palestine and Palestine, and explain how deregulation and shareholder value maximization results in that.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It's not just bad actors and the odd apple in a barrel. It is the system. Yeah. And I think unless we address the system, we're not going to win.
And I would just use as a teachable moment for everyone to acknowledge or to recognize that even Raj just flipped from talking about ESG in the context of sustainability to talking about it in the context of portfolio outperformance, which is another conflation that we do without even realizing we're doing it. So not to pick on Raj, but just to see how hard it is to keep these two things straight. Bill, give us your 10-second.
I'll make it really quick with two interlinked points. One is that I think that measuring success, you need to link the micro level or the enterprise level with the macro systems level. So that's what we've done with sustainability context all along, is that you're looking at what's the impact on the company and the company's impact on the greater world, within the ability of the greater world to withstand those impacts, or ideally flourish with it, that the impacts actually contribute to the flourishing at the macro level and at the micro level. I think that, translating this into the language of value, it's moving from looking at just enterprise value or the value of the organization itself, which is what the International Sustainability Standards Board is doing, to looking at what we call system value. Jeff Kendall from the Future Fit Business Benchmark coined that term. So that's the value that's actually inherent, not just at the enterprise level, but at your watershed level, or at, you know, the a whole population and its ability to thrive, or, you know, the ability of our climate regulatory system to function the way it's supposed to. So I'll leave it at that for brevity, so that we can get to some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And I would just make one brief point. It sort of echoes on what Clara said. You know, just because I'm passionate about this regenerative paradigm shift doesn't mean that all of these other issues like transparency and incremental activist issues and using teachable moments they're all part of the same thing, and they're not, you know, it's not an either or, it's a both, it's all and at the same time. And you know, I happen to have a perspective that I do believe that the system as we've known it is in some form of systemic collapse. And so the regenerative paradigm is getting us to get in front of what's become inevitable. But that doesn't mean that, you know, everyone's going to die and every corporation is going to go bankrupt. But I do think that just the imposition of planetary boundaries has a massive negative impact on business models of the global business community as a starting point. And then lots of new businesses will flourish out of that, which is all great. But we have to acknowledge that this is a once in the history of humanity negative impact that we're still in denial about. We still have this win-win. You know, we can make more money if we do ESG. You know, we're like in denial of the death phase of this phase of capitalism. And I'm sorry to say that, but that's where I'm coming from. So
great, thanks, John, and everyone else. Just an amazing dialogue, as we knew we'd get caught up in it.
I don't know. Given the time, maybe any last comments, Raj, Bill, and Clara?
I'll go ahead since I'm off mute. I guess I would just mostly thank Capital Institute for convening this conversation. I think that, you know, trying to bring some clarity to this space that's relatively convoluted, I think is really helpful. I'll echo Raj in saying that it's an honor to meet you more directly, Clara, after sort of being in the same spaces, email and LinkedIn spaces. And it's just always a pleasure to be on the same line as you, Raj. This has been wonderful, and I'd be glad to recap it, and also glad if folks think that they want to move on.
John, thank you very much for the invitation. Lovely to be on this panel with the rest. I think the conversation between the folks who are in your regenerative network and the people who are close to and inside the mainstream institutional investment community, that dialogue is really helpful, because these need to move and understand what you're doing, and vice versa. And so please keep going. You're doing a grand job.
Thanks, Raj. It was so glad you were able to join us. Clara, you get the last word.
Oh dear. I just want to say, I think Raj has just said it very, very well. It's we've got to be thinking about regeneration while we're doing all this fiddly stuff with accounting at the same time.
Yeah.
And that has to be some sort of dialogue. And we can't forget, I mean, we're kind of riveted on public companies because they happen to be disclosing entities, and in the States, you know, maybe the capital market is a third of the global ones, and they seem like huge and movable and this and that. But in fact, you know, there are, you know, huge peat bogs in, you know, in Africa, or the Amazon jungle, or a variety of other things that are extraordinarily important assets that need to be valued and somehow protected financially within the newer ecosystem before they are harmed. And so thinking about, I don't know, I don't want to go into the accounting of that, for goodness sakes, but thinking about how we incorporate, you know, the government's, smaller businesses, the private markets, et cetera, into this conversation, I think is something we have to contend with. There's both positives and negative energy there, and I think there's opportunity.
Yeah, we talk in the course, Clara, in the macro section, we're proposing that there needs to be an institution of the commons that is of the scale of the private sector, which in fact it will be bigger than the private sector and more complex, but the notion that we have the right institutions coming out of the past paradigm doesn't suggest that they're the right institutions for the future paradigm. So that's a
Yeah, all our institutions, I think, are up against it. They're all 19th and maybe early 20th century institutions. They're just not fit for this voyage.
exactly. So that gets back to Carrie's question. Well, listen, this has been great. I personally have not been able to keep up with the chat. So if there was questions that were in there that I missed, I apologize. But again, we don't want to take over everyone's full day. It's been great to have you all with us, and we will see you back the last Thursday of next month, and we'll figure out what the topic will be then. But great to have you all with us, and thanks especially to all of our guests. I knew it would be a rich discussion, and you all did exactly what I knew you would. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.